first. I'm going to present a paper. Okay, the title is a bit different, but don't worry. So I'm going to present a paper which is a joint work with Xavi Sirera, Marcio Cruz, and Minli, who are three co-authors at the World Bank. This just reflects the huge iteration of titles that we are exploring. So this is the previous version to the final one, that is the one that is included in the paper, okay, which is Anatomy of Technology in the Firm. And basically the motivation for this work is quite straightforward. We were interested, as many other economists and sociologists before us, in measuring technology. Okay, typically we have been interested in measuring technology for a variety of reasons. We want to document how technology changes over time. We want to see how technology's use or adoption is related to a variety of important phenomena like productivity or waste dispersion or how firms are structured. So there is a ton of things that are connected to technology. So for many of these reasons, it's important to measure technology. Now, we have been interested in measuring technology for a long time, at least since the first half of the previous century. And the traditional approach to measuring technology has consisted on documenting the presence of a very small set, typically one advanced technology in a firm. Okay, so for example, does the farm plant hybrid corn? Does the hospital use CAT scanners? Do firms have computers, or do workers use computers? So this is typically how we have measured technology. And the implicit assumption in that approach is that the technological landscape of firms, which is a relatively complex object, can be summarized, at least in a statistical sense, by this binary variable, which is, or close to a binary variable, which is whether certain advanced technology is present in the firm or not. Now, this approach, which is very widespread, in our view, has several important limitations. Okay, so in particular, the first one is that, especially in developing countries where these advanced technologies are not very prevalent, documenting that certain advanced technology is not present doesn't inform us about what other ways firms have to produce whatever they are producing. So once we have documented the presence of the technology, especially when the technology has been demonstrated not to be present, we cannot, we are left without any additional information about what technologies firms utilize. Now, the limitation is that the presence of a technology may mean very different things depending on whether the technology is used marginally or in a very widespread way. Okay, so we want to, we would like to document, to show or to reflect in a way the intensity of use of a technology. A third limitation is that when a technology is used in a firm, documenting that that's the case doesn't inform us about what it is used for, in particular what type of business function a firm conducts in a better way because the technology is applied to that business function. It's particularly troublesome when we are measuring the use of general purpose technology, which in principle can be applied to many different business functions. And more generally, assuming that we can represent this complex object, which is the technological landscape of a firm, by just this binary variable, the presence or absence of a given technology, it's a strong assumption which doesn't help in thinking about how we should aggregate this information. In principle, we would like our technology measures to also help us make progress in thinking about how different technologies complement each other and how we can build a firm-level technology aggregate that summarizes the technological dimension of the firm. Okay, that would be the ultimate goal. By having this binary variable, we are really not trying to even walk in that direction. So these are severe limitations that we see about this prevailing approach to measuring technology. What we do in this paper is to pretty much start from scratch, to say, okay, this prevailing approach, it has been good until now, but we think from now on we should do it better. And to do that, we are going to create a new survey, the Formal Adoption Technology Survey, FAT, that will allow us to collect detailed information that will characterize in a much more granular way the technologies that are utilized in the firm. Okay, and so the key block, the core of this FAT survey is what we call the grid. So the grid is a two-dimensional object, so to speak, where what we do with the help of a very large number of experts is to identify what are the business functions that firms conduct. I'm going to be very specific about what we mean by business functions, and I will provide you with some examples. And then once we identify these key business functions that the firm needs to conduct in order to produce the goods and services that they produce, and we go and we identify what are the technologies that firms can utilize to conduct the tasks required in that business function, from the more sophisticated technology to the least sophisticated. So like we cover the full array. And so what that gives us is it gives us a structure that help us, on the one hand, cover all the technologies that are required to conduct all the activities that are critical for the firm. Now, some of these activities are common to all the firms, regardless of the sector where they operate. Think about planning, or thinking about the payments or human resources. All of these things are activities, business functions that all the firms will have to conduct one way or the other, regardless of whether they are agricultural firms or whether we are talking about a bank. Okay, but then in addition, there are some activities, some business functions that are specific to the sector where the firm operates. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to construct grids which are specific for the business functions that are sector specific, and for 13 big sectors that will cover the majority of the firms that we have in the sample. Okay, so for all the firms, we'll have a general business function survey that will provide information and technologies used to conduct general business functions. But then for many firms, we will have a sector-specific business function survey that will cover the business functions that are specific to the sectors where they operate. Okay? And then overall, what we will end up is with 305 technologies that span 63 business functions. Okay, 7 of those are general, the remaining are sector-specific. Okay, and as I said, in each of these business functions, we will have the full coverage of the technologies that firms can utilize to conduct the business function, the activities in the business functions, from the basic to the more sophisticated. We will reflect the intensity with which the technologies are used, because we will ask 2 types of questions to the firms. First, we will ask whether they utilize each of the different technologies that they can use in the business function. But second, we will say, out of all of these technologies that you utilize, which is the one that you use most widely? And by focusing on that technology, we will be reflecting the intensity of use. Okay, this is going to be the key variable we're going to utilize in our analysis. So this machinery, we're going to bring it to the 3 different geographies in this paper. We're going to implement this survey in Senegal, in Vietnam, and in Brazil, in one state in particular, in Ceará. We're going to have a representative establishment level implementations of these surveys, okay, using the census sampling frames from each of these regions. Now, with this data,
Diego?
yes?
Can I ask a brief short question on the previous slide? This is
Sure.
Federico from the central bank. Why did you pick those countries? If there's any particular limitation? Because I mean, one concern you might have is that if you want to cover the full array of sort of more basic to more sophisticated technologies, maybe you would like to do the survey in a more developed economy to see how they differ with a less developed economy in terms of the type of sophistication they use in the technology.
Correct. And we are heading there. We are expanding now the number of countries. So we started with 3. Now I think we are close to 15, including countries that are richer like Korea or Poland. The reasons why we started with this had to do with funding, okay, mostly. Like, you know, there was like some funding attached. These are the type of details that I don't control, that they have to do with the World Bank. And it's very expensive to do the surveys because we have been doing them face to face. So each interview is expensive. We have close to 4,000 interviews. So I haven't asked about the total budget, but you know, it's a lot. Okay, it's not. And so there was interest. So this is not a random sample of countries, and so you're right that if we wanted to draw implications about cross-country variation or cross-regional variation in these in the technologies that are or the measure of technology that we construct, we would like to have other country coverage, okay, and we will get in that at some point in that, you know, in a position to analyze data from that perspective. What I'm going to show in a second is that the angle we take here is quite different from that. And so even if I focus on one particular region for my interest, that wouldn't be a big problem, as you would see.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
This is Ernesto Pastel from the bank too. I'd like to ask you a very basic question. Is when you study technology, do you mean what is in back of your mind is productivity at the very end? Or another way of saying it is or the adoption of technologies is something interesting for their own sake? Or what shall we care about the type of technologies that firms adopt?
Well, I mean, you are asking the Pope to talk about God, okay? So I like everything about God here. I like productivity, but I like technology.
But we may not belong to the same religion, so that's why I'm asking.
But this is why this is my seminar. I'm talking about the things that I care about. Sorry. No, I mean, I'm going to convince you, I think. I'm going to try to convince you that there are incredibly interesting things that you can learn just by looking at technology. I'm going to talk about productivity too, okay? In case that you just care about money, I'm going to talk about money. But this is I'm just making a joke. But there, I think that I think that I can ask you the question back at the end of the talk, and hopefully I will have told you. I mean, when I started this project, the things that I've learned with this project were unthinkable when I started it. And so I started the project with the same idea that you presented, which is, let me try to understand what drives productivity difference across firms. That was the initial take. And I've discovered that that's really the tip of the iceberg. There is a ton of incredible things underneath that are so much more interesting than that. Hopefully I will convince you about that.
I mean, I can imagine some stuff. For instance, I can imagine some I/O of technology generation and adoptions.
Just
wait.
Wait.
To fix ideas, exactly what we should be thinking of
wait.
when you present the details of the. Okay.
Wait 2 slides. slides. In 2 slides, I'm going to anticipate all the interesting things that we're going to see, and then I'm going to just flesh them out slowly as we progress. Okay, but I think it's a valid question. It's a very valid question. Okay, why do we care about this? So, and as I said, like, you know, I've learned the reason why I care about this once I've done the analysis, not before. So it's a very valid question to ask it at this point. Okay, so what are we going to do with this data? So we're going to have this very rich data. How are we going to analyze it? Well, we're going to do things that are relatively straightforward to transform the data into variables that we can analyze. Essentially, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to construct, for each business function in each firm, we're going to construct a measure that will reflect the sophistication of the technologies that is most widely used in the firm. Okay, so we have all of these technologies that can be ranked from the least sophisticated to the more sophisticated in a given business function. And so we're asking the firm to tell us which is the one that they use the most, and then we're going to assign our sophistication ranking to that measure, sophistication level to that technology, and that's the variable we're going to be analyzing. Okay. Now the beauty of this is that information is at the business function level. Okay, so for a given firm, I will have lots of information about how sophisticated are the technologies utilized in each of the different business functions that make up the firm. Okay, and here by firm I mean establishment. Okay, firm and establishment here are going to be the same because we're going to randomize at the establishment level. Okay, but the unit of information is not the establishment, it's the business function. Okay, we're going to see something inside the firm. Okay, and what that allows us is to characterize how are the technologies that firms utilize inside the firm, okay, in the different business functions. Okay, and in particular, this allows us to ask questions that are completely new. Okay, going back to Ernesto's question, why do we care about this? Because I can pose questions that didn't exist before. In particular, very basic question that got us started with this analysis is how similar or different are the sophistications of the technologies that firms utilize in different business functions. Okay, is it the case that good firms utilize sophisticated technologies in all the different business functions and bad firms utilize unsophisticated technology in different business functions? Or that's not the case? Is it the case that firms use very different levels of sophistication in different business functions? Okay, and if so, what type of model can explain this variation in the sophistication of the technologies that firms utilize across the different business functions? Okay, and once I understand that, and I build a structure that allows me to aggregate in a reasonable way, theoretically reasonable way, all this vector of technological sophistications across the different business functions of a given firm into a technology level, a firm level technology index. Okay, like the equivalent to the technological component of TFP at the firm level. Okay, but instead of being something ad hoc that comes either from a residual or from taking like some random average of information in the firm without any structure, here I'm going to use the data and some modeling structure to build an index that is reasonable, okay, that is like theoretically consistent. That's the reason why I care about this. Now, then I can connect this index to productivity, okay, and I'm going to do that, okay? But before I do that, there is a ton of things that I can learn, okay, which are much more interesting, at least for the moment, okay? So what am I going to find? What are my findings? Well, the first thing we do is something simple, is to take this information on business function level sophistication, and we're going to take like a simple average and construct firm level measure sophistication, okay, to begin with, just to, you know, analyze the data without any theory. And we're going to see how much dispersion there is in average sophistication across firms, and compare that to the dispersion there is in sophistication across countries, okay, when I average this across countries. This is completely theoretical, it's just like, you know, simple statistical analysis. I'm going to show you that there is a lot of variation in sophistication across countries, but there is even more variation in sophistication across the firms of a given country, okay? That's something which is interesting, is related to what we have what people have documented when looking at measures of TFP, for example. Okay. Now, one of the most striking facts that we're going to uncover is what happens when we look at the variation in sophistication of the technology utilized across the different business functions of a firm. Okay. I'm going to show you that the variation in sophistication within a firm is 2.8 times larger than the variation in sophistication across firms. Okay, there is huge dispersion in the sophistication that of the technologies that firms use across the different business functions of a given establishment. Okay, and that's an incredible finding. And it's something that we didn't expect. I didn't expect. It's huge. And then we're going to think a lot about how to analyze this data, how to put some structure that help us understand where this is coming from. Okay. In doing that, we're going to uncover another extremely interesting fact. Okay, which is what we call the technology curve. Okay. Suppose that you have, again, this measure of sophistication in a given business function of a firm. Okay, say, for example, in business administration. Okay, I have, for all the firms, I know what's the level of sophistication they have in business administration. And suppose that I plotted that against the average sophistication of each of the firms. Okay, I did a scatter plot of these two variables. On the vertical axis, the sophistication that each firm has in a particular business function, say business administration. On the horizontal axis, the average sophistication that firms have across the different business functions. Okay. When I plot that, what I see is that there is very striking increasing relationship between these two variables. Okay. Interesting thing is that this relationship is extremely stable. It is great, and we call it the technology curve. Okay. It's equivalent to the Engel curve in consumption. Okay. The way to interpret it is that when a firm wants to implement a higher level of sophistication, how are they going to go to different business functions to implement it? Are they going to get more business administration technology, or are they going to get more marketing technology or more payments technology? And what turns out is that firms are going to generate very different expansion rates in these different business functions. Okay, in the same way that firms, that consumers, the households want to implement very different, want to consume very different combinations of different types of goods in order to attain a certain utility level. Okay, when you want to increase your utility, you're going to put more weight on services than in agricultural goods. Okay, because services are income elastic, while agricultural goods are income elastic. Okay, something similar happens here with the technologies that firms utilize across different business functions, and we're going to see that there is huge variation in the slopes of technology curves. There are some business functions like business administration, which is extremely technology elastic. The slope is 1.8, while there are other business functions which are very technology inelastic. And so the variation, for example, in the general business functions is almost by a factor of 9, okay, in the slopes, in the ratios of the slopes. It's huge. Okay, it's even larger than what we see when we go to consumption theory. Okay, and these slopes, these technology curves, they are not very prevalent. They are not just prevalent in the data, but they explain a huge amount of the within firm variance in technology sophistication. They explain about 30% of the variance. Okay, so they are very simple, very stylized constructs that the data displays for us, and they are very important to explain this variation within firms in technology sophistication. Okay. Then I'm going to take this machinery, I'm going to relate it to productivity, and I'm going to show you that the technology level measures of sophistication, they account for between 24% and 30% of the observed cross-firm difference in productivity. Okay, and so that's how I'm going to conclude the paper. You can have that. Okay, these are the main findings. Now, let me just jump and explain you. Well, I'm going to show you a little bit of the literature very quickly, and then I will start talking about the data and how we build the survey and the technology measures. Okay, so there are three literatures that are connected to what we do here. The first one is there's a long literature that has tried to measure technology in a variety of ways, going back to the measurements of hybrid corn by Ryan and Gross and by Grilikes, and then trains, electric locomotives by Mansfield, CAT scanners by Trachtenberg. I mean, there is a very, very long tradition in economics and sociology trying to measure technology for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because people wanted to understand technology, sometimes because people wanted to understand the consequences of technology or the drivers of technology. And there is another strand related to the work we're going to conduct here that has tried to explore the connections between technology and productivity at different levels of aggregation: country, region, the firm. And so typically when you go to more granular units of analysis, you become more coarse in the measure of technology. So when you have a higher level of aggregation, the analysis tend to have richer characterization of the technology at that level of aggregation. When you go to the firm, you end up with something which is relatively simple, like, for example, this one by Hort and Paulsen, whether you have access to the internet, which is something relatively coarse in the measurement. A third literature, which is connected to what we are going to do here, is the literature of management practices, which has been pushed forward in a very spectacular way by Bloom and Riemann. And so in that literature, in the same way as what we do here, there is a motivation, which is the interest in collecting more granular information on either, in their case, management practices, in our case, technologies at the firm level using survey methods. Okay, that's what we share in common, and then in both cases we want to connect that to productivity at some point. The key difference, in addition to things that are quite obvious, like the details of the methods, the survey methods, and the details of the nature of what we're trying to measure, that we're trying to measure technology, they are trying to measure management practices. The key difference, however, is that we are really vested in understanding technology within the firms. Okay, that's what I think is our main contribution. And that's all the progress we're going to make in that dimension is novel. I think that's to some extent uncharted territory. Okay, so as I mentioned, yes.
This is Federico again. Sorry to interrupt. So on the literature, there's another literature that might be related, which is all this literature on the organization of production. Say the work of Esteban Rossi-Hansberg, Lorenzo Caliendo, and Garicano, where they look at how production is organized within the firm and how that implies different structures, hierarchies in terms of vertical versus horizontal, and how that affects productivity and so on. It's not exactly the same because it's not directly about adoption of technologies, but it is related somehow in the sense of maybe different technologies will be more amenable with the specific types of hierarchies within the firm in terms of how people are organized, and how that and that could potentially affect what type of technology you can adopt and so on. So maybe there's an interaction with that literature or not.
I think it's a very distant relative. Okay, so I mean, it's about firms and technology. Yes, it's connected, but the emphasis in the literature on technology is minimal. It's mostly theoretical. It's like we have access to information technologies. That's it. There is very little attempt to measure it. Whenever it's measured in these very coarse ways. And the emphasis there is about, like, as you say, how you build a hierarchy, like, informational hierarchy. We are going to take a very different approach. So our notion of production is going to be focused mostly on the technological aspect to it. We're going to put very little emphasis on workers or how workers are organized or things like that, or even how workers interact with technology. So I mean, you will see, you will tell me at the end, but I see, I know the literature a little bit, and it's very far from, because again, at least, you know, in this one, we really have in common this interest in collecting data, okay? While in that literature, there's absolutely no interest in collecting data. You know, there is not, none of these papers has collected data. At most, they have used some administrative data that documented, like, you know, layers of production, okay? But there is no, like, you know, Esteban is not somebody that goes and gets his hands dirty, you know, because I've worked with him. Okay, so so basically this is how I want to use my time. I have like until 45, so I have like 40 minutes, okay? So I want to get, in a relatively elegant way, I want to go quickly over this part here to make sure that we, you know, that we are clear about the details of how we implement these things and that it's all sensible. But then I really want to spend time on this part here, because this is where all the cool stuff happens. So I want to devote at least 15 minutes to explaining not just the findings, but also the structure. Okay, there is a framework, a theoretical model behind it, which is relatively simple but very sophisticated at the same time, and very powerful in terms of the implications as well as how the data embraces it. So I want to make sure that we really talk about this. Okay, so survey is a huge amount of work. I mean, I really didn't know what I was getting into. I mean, these people at the World Bank, they are masters at doing the surveys and they know everything and I knew nothing. Basically, the survey is, this object is very long. It has 5 modules. In one of them, we ask for these general business functions. In another one, we focus on sector specifics, and then we have some measures of performance, okay? The key structure in the survey is this grid of business functions and technologies, okay? So think of it as a matrix. And so basically, this is an example of the grid for the general business function. So the idea is like we went through desk research, we went to talk to experts inside the bank, and we want to talk to experts outside the bank. These are people that know a lot about production. And so basically what they did was they helped us come up with business functions that reflected the key tasks, the key activities that take place within firms. Okay, and these are the general, these are the ones that are common to all the firms. So for example, these are administration, production or operation planning, sourcing, marketing, sales, payment methods, quality control, okay? And then in each of these business functions, we had an array of potential technologies that could be utilized to conduct the key tasks that are essential in the business functions, okay? So for example, you can do this administration either by having handwritten processes. This is basically pencil and paper, like that's the most primitive way of administering the firm and running the firm. Or you can go all the way to having an ERP system, okay, which is basically a sophisticated piece of software that allows you to key in certain information, and then once you enter the information, then it's going to appear in all the different activities that you do, not just for planning, but also for inventory management, for organizing your sales and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's like there is a gradient of how rich are the technologies, the ways in which you can the technologies that you can use to conduct the key tasks in the different business functions. Okay, same thing with sales, payment methods, quality control, etc. Okay, and we have done this basically for all the for this general business function, but also for the sector specific. So for example, here we have the case of food processing, which is one of the main sectors we have. And then we have the different business functions being like input testing, mixing, blending, and cooking, antibacterial, packaging, food storing. And so these are like the different functions. And then in each of these, you can go, for example, input testing, you can do it like, just by smelling whether the meat that you're using in your food is good or not, looks good, or it smells good, all the way to using like some computer testing, okay, which is like something that is very sophisticated. And so we have gone together with the experts, with many meetings with experts, through the pain of coming with these grids that put, I think, relevant structure into what are the key tasks that firms undertake and what are the technologies that you can use to implement these tasks. And now this grid basically, it has certain properties. First, it's comprehensive, okay? So it's going to cover the key business functions, and it's going to cover the full array of technologies. This is something that we test, okay? We ask firms one by one which of the different technologies they utilize, and we allow them to say, well, we use something else, okay? And in less than 2% of the cases, firms declare that they use something else that we are not throwing at them, okay? So in a very minimal number of cases, firms seem to use technologies that are not the ones that are covering the grid, okay, to conduct this business functions. And the grid is relevant, so that means that the same grid applies to all the firms in a given sector, okay? So it doesn't matter whether you are a farmer, small farmer planting rice in the foothills of Vietnam, or a mega farmer in Brazil. Like the general business functions as well as sector-specific business functions for crops are relevant for both of you, okay? And so you will select different levels of sophistication, but you will find that the grid properly characterizes your production processes, okay? Technologies are very precisely defined, okay? There is no judgment involved in determining whether you use or you don't use a given technology, okay? The enumerators, they go with vignettes. They understand what is the technologies they are asking about. They're able to communicate that to the respondents, and so it's a completely objective issue what we are trying to assess. There is no subjective element to it. There is no guessing, no interpretation on the side of the enumerator. Okay. So these have to do with a long section in the paper where we discuss, like, all the potential bias that have to do with bias and mistakes that have to do with how questions are made, bias that come from the enumerator, how he interprets the information, and bias have to do with the respondent. Okay, so we go through a number of ex ante and ex post checks to make sure that those bias are not relevant. Okay, and that's discussed at length in the paper. Okay, now in each of these business functions, the technologies can be run from the least sophisticated to the more sophisticated, okay? And this characterization reflects either the capacity to conduct more tasks of the technology, the fact that the additional tasks that it can conduct, they are more difficult, or the fact that it can carry the task in a more efficient way, okay, either with greater speed or accuracy. So that's how we are going to interpret this notion of sophistication, okay? It's something that in the context of models of economic growth, it's very natural, okay? Like, think about quality ladders. Quality ladders are a good characterization of most of these business functions. Sometimes, however, that's not exactly the case. And so it would be the case that some of these technologies, they are not at different levels of sophistication. They are similar levels, and so that would be reflected. Okay, so it's not that we always have a one-to-one mapping between where this is represented graphically and the level of sophistication. There are cases where a couple of technologies will be at the same level, and that's reflected in the ranking. So the way we're going to construct the sophistication measure will be clear in the next slide. Okay. So we are going to use a sampling frame that allows us, that is going to be representative both at the sector, firm, size, and region. Okay, and that means that we can draw inference at each of these levels of aggregation. We're going to interview close to 4,000 establishments in the three geographies. And in each place, as I mentioned, we're going to ask which of these technologies you utilize in each business function, and of each of these technologies that you utilize, which is the one that you use the most in the business function, okay? this paper, we're going to focus on that second question. Okay. And in
Diego,
particular, yep.
very quickly, in the survey, is there a way to extract from the respondents how important or how critical is a business function for them, for instance, for profits or for some other?
No, no, there is not. There is not. And that's something that, you know, we may want to I think we can infer it from the data we collect using the structure that we build. Okay, it's not something that we do at this point. Okay, but I think it's something that it's a parameter in the production function that I'm going to present later, and I think it's a parameter that we can we can potentially identify in the data. Okay. But it's not something that they will declare to us. We don't ask them which is the business function that is more important for you. We don't ask that question.
Another related question: is there a way to infer in the data whether the business function is something that they have to do in-house as opposed to outsourcing?
Yes, we ask that. So we, before asking them whether they use any of these technologies, we have a question that is, do you do this in-house or do you outsource it? We also allow for the possibility that is done in the firm, but not in this particular establishment. Okay. Now, the answer varies a little bit from sector to sector, but in general, in a huge number of cases, they do everything in-house. Okay. So I would say that the number that pops to mind is that on average, again, it's around 2%, the number of cases, firm/business functions that are not done in-house. Okay. It varies a little bit. So there is one function, I think it's design in clothing, in apparel and clothing, which I think is 10% of the cases is outsourced and 10% of the cases is done in-house, but in a different establishment. Okay, that's the one that is least that is in most cases not done in the particular establishment. Okay, it's a huge outlier. In most of the other cases, in the other sectors, in the other business functions, it's a very, very small case. I think the average number is around 2%. Okay, but this particular one, I know it because I was checking the numbers the other day, because there is a very interesting research question which has to do with outsourcing. Okay, so here we have lots of information about which firms outsource, but also which business functions are outsourced. And the model we are building may have some implications to that, and there may be a technological theory of outsourcing that is very different from existing theories which emphasize contractual frictions, for example. So here is not, so that's something which we collect so much data. There is interesting questions to be addressed in future research, and one of them has to do with that. Okay, but from the perspective of analysis, I think that is not critical. It's not critical for what we're going to do today. But I think in and of itself, it's something interesting. Okay. So this is what I was discussing before. We go through a number of checks. I'm not going to spend time with them. But in reality, the quality of the data is extremely good. Okay, there is high response rates. We have done some pilots, or we have gone back to some of the establishments and asked them the questions randomly, and find that there is a huge amount of coincidence in the answers between different rounds of questions. So what do we do with the data? Well, we're going to do the following. So we have this information about which is the most widely used technology in a given business function. Now we can we know what's the ranking or sophistication of that technology in the business function. Let's call this RFJ. Okay, so this is the ranking of the sophistication of the business function of technology of the particular technology that the firm J is using in business function F. Okay, and this goes from 1, which is the least sophisticated technology in the business function, to RF, which is the more sophisticated technology in the business function. Okay, so we define this variable, which we call the relative ranking, which is basically a ratio of RFJ to RF. Okay, we subtract 1 in both cases, so that basically this is going to be a variable that goes from 0 to 1. Okay, now the World Bank, they don't like zeros. I still don't understand very well why, but they don't like zeros. So what we do is we rescale this variable to define our sophisticated measure. We multiply it times 4 and we add 1, so that this variable sophistication in business function F in firm J will go from 1 to 5. Okay, it will be a linear variable that will reflect the ranking of sophistications in the business function. Okay, so what is important to know here is that underlying the construction of this variable is the assumption that there's going to be constant increments. Okay, so when you move one step higher in the sophistication ranking, the variable increases by a constant amount. Okay, and it doesn't matter whether you are making the first step or the last step; it's all linear. Now, I'm going to discuss this in the next 5 minutes. Okay. In particular, this is something that we economists typically, especially in macro, we don't worry too much about this. Okay, we don't worry too much about how we move from ordinal variables such as these rankings to cardinal variables like these indices. Okay. However, people in labor or education, they worry a ton about this because they have noticed that depending on how you cardinalize these ordinal variables, you can change sometimes the conclusions from the analysis. Okay, so there is a literature on how, what type of checks you should do in order to make sure that this is not a problem. Okay, against my will, I had to dive deep in that literature. Okay, and we have done everything that can be done to demonstrate that our results are robust to cardinalizations. Okay, so I'm going to go through one slide through the different things we have done. Hopefully I will convince you that this is the case. So the first thing that we know is that if we want to compare country means of two distributions of ordinal variables like this one, a necessary condition a sufficient condition for the ranking of the means, of the population means, to be immune to the cardinalization is that there is a first-order stochastic dominance of one distribution over the other. Okay, we know since Pareto that first-order stochastic dominance is going to ensure robustness of comparisons of population means of cardinalizations of ordinal variables. Okay, now. For these 3 geographies that we have, you can see in the paper, we have restricted first-order stochastic dominance. Okay, so that means that we have first-order stochastic dominance all over the range, but in the 2 extremes, at 0 and at 5. Okay, so basically, for a particular purpose, we have stochastic dominance. So what that means is that comparisons of country means or regional means are going to be robust to any increase in transformation of these ranking variables that we have here. Second exercise that you may be interested in is to try to look at the association between the sophistication measure and some firm characteristics like productivity or firm size or whether it's an exporter or not. Now there is a work by Schroeder and Zizaki that has developed the necessary conditions for associations between variables to not be sensitive to the particular cardinalizations. Okay, and so this has to do with a condition called that the LMA curve doesn't intersect the horizontal axis, and we check for every single regression that we run. We check that that's the case, and we always satisfy this LMA condition. So it's never going to be the case that the association that I present between 2 variables changes sign if I use a different cardinalization of these technology rankings. Now, there are other things that we do other than running like, associations or computing means. And so what you could think is that there is a more general way to cardinalize these ordinal variables. Instead of using this linear index that I've defined before, you could think of generalizations where this parameter phi is either smaller than 1 or greater than 1, and then you're going to have either concave or convex versions of the index, okay? And so the reason why that's interesting is because when you make phi smaller than 1, the first steps in the technology sophistication are going to generate very large changes in the sophistication index, while if 5 is smaller than 1, it would be the last steps, the ones that generate big changes in the sophistication index. Now, we have, analyzed the robustness of our findings to this type of more general cardinalizations of the technology rankings. And so we have done that in two different ways. The first one is to consider a very wide range of phi. Say, okay, what's a range of phi that is like really, really sufficient for us to be happy? And so we have considered a range that goes from 1/3 to 3, and that generates increments, ratios of increments at the bottom and at the top that are completely crazy. They are like so large. They are of, up to a factor of 27 between the increments in sophistication when you move from one step to the next at the bottom versus at the end. Okay, they are so large that they are completely crazy from the perspective of our technology experts. And we have shown that even when we take this wide range of phis, we still get the same results. All the results we draw in the paper are robust. There is a more sophisticated way to do this analysis, which consists in anchoring sophistication on something observable, something that is relevant in the firm, like productivity. Okay, and so what we have done is we have asked the question, for which value of phi is the average sophistication of a firm similar in the sense of having the same skewness as the distribution of productivity that we see in the data. Okay, so for which value of phi we have similar skewness in the distribution of sophistication and the distribution of productivities. And the answer is, well, that's the case when phi is slightly smaller than 1. Okay, somewhere between 2/3 and 1. Okay, when we have a value of phi which is smaller, is close to 1, slightly smaller than 1, but close to 1, we get a distribution across firms of average sophistication which has the same skewness as the distribution across firms of log productivity. Okay, and so that's, given that we think that sophistication is tied to productivity, that's a hint about what we think is a plausible range for phi. Okay, having said that, we're going to we do in the appendix checks for all the results with when phi is in this much wider range. Okay, so let me move on because I'm doing bad in terms of time. Let me show you a little bit the data. Okay, so for example, here I'm plotting the sophistication index for two firms in the different business functions. Okay, so these are two firms in Senegal that are in food processing. One of the firm is small, is in dash blue, and the other firm is big, is in red solid line. Okay, and so what you can see is that there is a ton of information in these plots. Okay, so for example, like you could just compute the average sophistication. Here we have general business functions. Here we have sector-specific business functions. Okay, you could compute the average sophistication in these two firms and compare it, and then you could say something along the lines that the small firm has less average sophistication in technology than the big firm. Okay, but by doing that, you would be missing a ton of information. Okay, in particular, you would be missing the fact that the small firm, for example, tends to have more uniform sophistication across the different business functions, while the big firm, sometimes it has the same level of sophistication as the small firm, but sometimes it has much larger sophistication, and in some cases it has even smaller. Okay, so like sometimes, like in cooking here, you have the small firm have higher sophistication than the big one. Okay, the big one like doesn't do much cooking. So one question that arises is like, is there a pattern of this variation of sophistication across business functions by which bigger firms tend to have more sophistication than small firms? Or is there a pattern by which, as firms become more sophisticated, they tend to increase the sophistication in certain business functions rather than others? Okay, is there a pattern of upgrading of technology sophistication? These are questions that it's very hard to answer with just 2 observations, but with our data set, we can analyze them. Okay, I'm going to jump into that part of the paper, so I'm going to skip this cross-firm analysis, and I'm going to focus on the within firm. Okay, so. Particular, I want to exploit the granularity of the information that I have collected and study how much variation there is in sophistication across the business functions of a firm. Okay, so to do that, I would like to introduce a bit of notation. So let me use let me call SFJC to the level of sophistication that a firm J has in business function F in country C. Okay, now I could decompose this into a firm fixed effect alpha J, a business function level fixed effect beta F, and then a residual. Okay, and this residual basically will allow me to see how much variation, by focusing on the variance of this residual, I can see how much variation there is across the different business functions in sophistication across the different business functions of a firm. Okay, in particular, what I want to do is I want to compare the variance of this residual across the different business functions of a given firm with the variance of this fixed firm level fixed effect, which reflects the dispersion in sophistication across firms. Okay, and so I'm going to do that. If you will focus just on the first column, I'm going to do that. If I look at this bottom row, what this reflects is the variance of average sophistication across firms relative to the country level. That's point 2. When I look at the variance of this residual, which is the dispersion in sophistication across the different business functions of a given firm, the variance of that residual is 2.8 times larger than the variance that we see in average sophistication across firms. Okay, so in other words, we see much more variation within a firm than across firms when it comes to technology sophistication. Okay, this is an important finding. Okay, at the very least, it's important because I think it's, at least for me, it's the first time I see that statistic. And second, because it derails the notion that we have in our models that technology in a firm is equal to a firm level parameter, okay? And that's it. And in a way, like, the assumption is that where this firm level parameter comes, it just reflects the sophistication that this firm has, okay? Technological sophistication that this firm has. Well, what we see here is that index, yes, maybe summarizes the sophistication of a firm, but it's very different than the average sophistication that the firm has, okay? There is lots of variation within a firm. Now, one thing that you can see is that this average sophistication is going to be, so this dispersion in sophistication is much higher in regions where average productivity is higher. Okay, so if you compute the average dispersion sophistication across the firms of a given region, the more sophisticated is the region, the higher is going to be the dispersion. More relevantly, suppose that you go to firms and you ask, okay, which firms have greater dispersion sophistication? So the dependent variable here is the within firm variance in sophistication across the business functions. And then I can throw in this regression, I can look at the average sophistication of the firm. I can look at observable characteristics like the firm size measured by the number of employees, or the age of the firm, or when the firm is an exporter or a multinational. Okay, what you can see is that the key driver of within firm sophistication across firms is whether the firm is more sophisticated or not. Okay, more sophisticated firms have greater dispersion than less sophisticated firms. firm size, even firm age, they don't matter, okay? To a first order, once they control for average sophistication, whether the firm is small or large, whether the firm is young or old, it doesn't matter, okay? Now, why is this important? Well, this is going to be important because with a little bit of a modeling help, it's going to shed light on what drives within firm sophistication, okay? So I want to build a model of technology adoption within the firm, okay? To do that, let me first introduce a relatively simple production structure, okay? I'm going to just focus on technology in this model. And so the first thing I need to introduce is what I call a technology index for the firm, okay? This is AJ. This is an aggregator of how we are going to integrate all this information about the sophistication that the firm has in the different business functions, okay? And so this index AJ can be expressed in this implicitly as an aggregate of the vector of sophistication that firm J has in the different business functions N, okay? Now, this index, this aggregator, it's a non-homothetic constant lattice substitution aggregator, which has the property that when these epsilon f's are equal to 1 minus sigma, sigma is the lattice substitution in sophistication between the different business functions, between the sophistication of the different business functions. When this epsilon f is equal to 1 minus sigma, then this aggregator boils down to the standard homothetic CES aggregator, okay? It's the standard, like, you know, Dixit-Stiglitz aggregator we use all the time in economics, okay? Now, the difference here is that when epsilon f is different from 1 minus sigma, then the loading of the sophistication in AJ is going to differ across business functions. In particular, when I increase sophistication of a particular business function, how much that's going to affect the technology index depend on epsilon f, okay? If epsilon f is greater, that means that the business function will be technology elastic, and means it will have a larger effect in AJ than when epsilon f is smaller, okay? Now, to provide a little more of intuition about what this index AJ buys for me, you can do a first order approximation of this index around the average firm. And so what that allows you is to write AJ in the following linear form. So this beta is a constant. This SJ is the average sophistication in the firm, okay? So AJ is going to be greater whenever I have greater average sophistication, okay? But the variance is going to matter too, okay? In particular, firms that have greater variance in sophistication across business functions will tend to have greater average technology, okay? The reason for that is because for a given correlation between the relevance of the business function and the sophistication of the technologies in the business function, the variance, greater variance gives me greater covariance, which means that for a given average allows firms, greater covariance allows firms to put more sophistication into the business functions that are more relevant, okay? When I keep constant the average sophistication and I increase the covariance, what I'm doing is I'm allowing firms to allocate that sophistication to the business functions that really are critical, and that's going to end up in a higher level of sophistication, okay, of technology index, sorry, okay? Now, this is the structure, yes?
Very quickly, one could imagine from the previous result, from the empirical result, I mean, that there could be some fixed costs in the adoption technologies for different business functions.
Yes.
And that may be an alternative way to model it. Is there anything in the data that allows you to rule out that possible modeling alternative?
I'm going to explain you in a second how I think about technology adoption. So far, I just talked about production, okay? I'm doing very bad in terms of time, so I may take at least 5 more minutes. But basically, the way you have to think about this is that this is like a production function in a way. I haven't talked about output, but like, you could think that output is going to be a log linear function of this AJ, okay? You could think of this AJ as being like the TFP level of the firm, okay? But this TFP now is going to be connected to this sophistication of the most widely used technologies, okay? I haven't told you yet how you are going to implement these sophistication levels. That comes right here, okay? So, particular, suppose the following, okay? Suppose that the profits of the firm J, they can be written in this way. So they're going to be an increasing function of AJ, okay? Let's make it increasing and concave. This profit function can be firm specific, okay? Now, as Ernesto was suggesting, now what about the cost of implementing this technology? Well, suppose that this cost of implementing this technology, they have the following form, okay? And you tell me whether this is sufficiently general for you or not. Suppose that the cost of implementing a technology with sophistication SFJ, it has a firm level fixed effect, J, CJ. Then they have a business function level fixed effect that can vary by technology characteristics of the firm, okay? So this is like, there's a certain cost associated to implementing higher technologies, more sophisticated technologies in business administration, which is particularly large for small firms, for example, okay? So this is what this is reflecting, okay? And then I have this term that is basically increasing in the levels of sophistication. It's convex in sophistication, okay? And so this gives you a model of adoption. Basically, you can take out the first order conditions, the optimal policy function for the sophistication of the firm by maximizing the net revenues or the revenues net of the cost of implementing the technologies, and the policy function that arises takes the following form. Firm J will implement sophistication S in business function F, where this level has a firm specific component, kappa J, a business function specific component, kappa F, and then there are two parts that are interesting, okay? The first part basically reflects these non-homotheticities in production. When you want to reach a technology level, AJ, you're going to put different loadings in different business functions depending on how technology elastic they are. If they are very technology elastic, if epsilon F is very high, then you want to load the sophistication of these business functions. If epsilon F is very small, then you're going to generate less sophistication, okay? In addition, variation in the cost that is, the component of the cost that is specific to the business function and to the technology characteristics, to the observable characteristics of the firm, is going to reduce the sophistication. If you are in a firm that is implementing a business that is trying to implement more sophisticated technologies in business functions in which is particularly costly, then that's going to lower the sophistication, okay? Now, why is this cool? Well, this is cool for two reasons, okay? The first reason why it's cool is because I can connect it to the within firm variance, okay? If you recall my definition of within firm variance, I removed this sector, this firm and business function fixed effects from the sophistication measure. And so basically that allowed me to, that kills these two terms. And so the within firm variance is basically the variance of these terms to the right. And basically what it tells me is that there are two sources of within firm variance. The first one has to do with these non-homotheticities. If there is variance in epsilon F, is basically there are non-homotheticities, then firms that want to implement a higher level of sophistication, firms that want to reach higher level of technology index, they are going to produce this variation in sophistication across firms, okay? And this is the first driver of variation in sophistication, is differences in the value of having better technology across business functions, okay? In addition, if there is this variation in the interaction between the cost, the component that interacts the business function with the firm characteristics, then that's going to generate also variance in sophistication, okay? Now, what you can see is that the regressions I run here, they speak about how important these two factors are. In particular, what they tell me is that this first factor that has to do with the dispersion in technology elasticities is very important, because the level of sophistication, the average level of sophistication, is a key driver of within firm variance. Instead, the firm characteristics that in principle could correlate with the cost of implementing technology across business functions. For example, if you are in a small firm and you don't have access to finance, and that makes it very costly for you to implement more sophisticated technologies that are very capital intensive, for example, what Ernesto had in mind, like you have a big sunk cost to cover, that should show up in these regressions as having a large effect of size on the variation in technology sophistication, and I see nothing related to that. Like, that's not present, which suggests that this variance is very small, okay? It's not relevant. Now, this is the first implication from this analysis. The second one is that I can forget about within firm variance. I can directly try to estimate this in the data, okay? I can go to the data and I can try to estimate these technology curves, okay? Instead of estimating it, first I'm going to plot it. I'm going to go business function by business function, and then for each firm I'm going to plot this and plot this. But instead of plotting this, what I'm going to plot is this first order approximation. Okay, I'm going to compute this. Okay, and so I'm going to plot this sophistication in the business function for firm J against the technology, the average technology index in the firm J. Okay, and so when I do that, so here I'm just plotting it by decile. So each dot is a decile of the distribution of technology sophistication. What you see is that there is these curves that go from that go up. They're increasing curves. They are actually they're not badly approximated by a straight line. And the key observation is that the slope varies widely across business functions. There are business functions where, in order to implement a higher level of technology index, you want to have very much higher level of sophistication, while in others you implement a higher level of technology index and you don't want to change dramatically your sophistication. Okay, that's what we call the technology curve. Okay, and this is the equivalent in consumption theory to the Engel curve. In the Engel curve, you want to implement higher level of utility, and you're going to increase a lot your services, and you're going to increase very little your agricultural goods, okay? Because agriculture is income inelastic and services is income elastic, okay? Here is the same thing, but for technologies. These technology curves, they are present in all the business functions, okay? These are for agriculture, okay? You can see that they are also like beautiful, like, irrigation is very technology elastic, packing is technology inelastic, okay? Food processing, the same thing. Wearing and apparel, the same thing. Wholesale and retail, the same thing, okay? These are the estimates we are getting, okay? And so you can see that the range of these slopes is very large. It's like a factor of 9 almost, okay? And this is the coefficient within firm dispersion, which is positive, as you would expect. And the R-square of this technology curve is very large, okay? On average, it's around 0.3, okay? So we are trying to explain this within firm variance and sophistication, which was this element that was extremely varied a lot across firms. And the majority of this variation can be explained by these very simple constructs, basically these technology curves, okay? And that's the main finding of the paper. So I'm already out of time. I would like to leave a little bit of time for questions. So let me just jump into my conclusions and recap, okay? So we have introduced some new data that provides a very rich characterization of the technology that firms use with different business functions that are critical to conduct their activities, okay? The main findings that we have are that there is this huge variance in technology sophistication within firms, okay? And in particular, within the more sophisticated firm, okay? We have built a simple model. I'm sorry to have rushed a little bit, but the details are in the paper. That basically, the key simple model of technology adoption, that the key insight is that we're going to allow for both heterogeneity across business functions in the marginal cost of adopting more sophisticated technologies, but also in the marginal benefit of adopting. Okay, and the key modeling trick, the key modeling element of our setting is that we are going to introduce this heterogeneity, the marginal value of sophistication through non-homothetic production function. Okay. By doing that, basically, we are able to capture a feature of the data, which is the technology curve. Okay, technology curve is something that the data is begging to have a model that allows for these technology curves, and in our case, that's a direct implication of the non-homothetic production function. These non-homothetic production functions seem critical to explain the dispersion of technologies, sophistication across business functions, and they help us explain a significant fraction of the cross-firm variation in productivity. Okay, I'm going to leave it there in case that you have any questions, so I'm not to eat all my time.
Do you have any questions, Ernesto?
I do, but I want others to speak if they want to. Okay, I'll ask a very question then. It's fascinating to learn about your God, and then and all the evidence that you show us is cross-sectional, and I understand that the conclusion that you're getting is cross-sectional. I wonder whether you may like to say something about the time dimension, how these gaps can get close, whether these gaps are healthy, maybe, we don't know. And how that may be closing down or widening through time and some other thoughts about it.
Yes. No, you're spot on. We don't have much to say about the time series. We have two avenues to say something about the time series. One that we haven't exploited yet, which is that in the survey, one other question that we ask is for the top tiers of the technologies in each business function, we ask firms how long ago did you implement, if you implemented any of these technologies, how long ago did you implement it? Okay. And so what that gives us is a sense of the dynamics of the technology adoption process. In particular, one thing that it gives us that we have started to look at is it gives us some diffusion curves across firms. So this is a much more traditional notion of diffusion. We still haven't done much with it. Another thing that we have done is, due to COVID, there was some interest in understanding how technologies was changing in firms. Okay? So all of these questionnaires were administered before COVID. So they were administered in 2019. That's before COVID, 2019. But then with COVID, there was interest in going back to some of these companies and ask them how their technologies were changing due to COVID, okay? And how that either the pre-COVID technologies or their upgradings were helping them handle the pandemic, okay? So we did that. So we came back and we found that in firms that were more sophisticated before COVID, they could do two things. One is, first, they found they were able to experience smaller declines in sales during COVID, okay? Because they were already like using more sophisticated technologies that to a large extent were more digital, okay? They were more digital technologies. But in addition, they were also more prone to upgrade further the technologies, okay? And because of the additional upgrading, they were also able to cope with COVID. We found that these effects were very nonlinear, that basically firms that were in the bottom distribution, if you increase them a little bit, their pre-COVID technologies, they were able to increase just a little bit their resilience during COVID. But that when you move when you move beyond this bottom quartile, like the effects were much larger, and that the majority of the effect didn't come from the upgrading. The upgrading basically accounted for 1 in 6, basically, of the effect that we find overall. But the majority came from the pre-COVID technologies. Okay, so all the upgradings they were going in the right direction. They were present and they were affecting the company. But the majority of the impact came directly from the pre-COVID technology, not from the upgrading. So that's how we have handled a little bit the dynamics. Going forward, you're right that it's very interesting to there is a sense in which many of these theories have a dynamic flair. I'm posing them in the cross section, but really they have an interpretation that has to do with if you want to move on, you want to move higher in your technology sophistication, how are you going to do it? What are the barriers that you face? So dynamics seem part of the story. But unfortunately, most of the data, as I'm describing, it's cross-sectional, so I cannot do much with it. And so all I can do is to compare firms and take advantage of the fact that we have lots of cross-sectional information to analyze it. So.
Related to the dynamics, one important dimension is policy. So suppose that we want, for some reason, increase the sophistication within firms. From your paper, I think we learned that will happen if we are successful to do that. That will happen only in some functions within the firms, as opposed to uniformly across the whole firm.
Yeah.
And something that particularly I'm not sure about this, but I think that something not so fancy of the non-homotheticity is that it doesn't give you, since it's a deep parameter, I'm not that sure how that can be influenced with policy. If it would be something else, probably we could say, we could treat this as the purchase of durables, let's say. Yeah. And then we know how to deal with that. But with non-homogeneity, I don't know.
There are two interesting ways to think about policy, okay? And this is all super new, okay? So this is things that I've been thinking super recently. So take them with a grain of salt. There is one more trivial dimension, which is that once you increase the incentives of the firm to implement a higher level of higher technology, to attain a higher technology, then the firm will decide how they want to expand. Okay, so costs seem relatively less relevant for the specific path of expansion. They may be relevant for the overall level of technology that the firm has, but not so much about whether it goes in this direction or the other direction. Okay, so it's about providing the incentives to implement technologies, and they will go into the path that is, in general, the theory tells us that they have strong incentives to go in certain directions and not in others. And in principle, when they do that, that shows up in higher level of sophistications and higher productivity. Having said that, there is a normative interpretation of this theory, okay, which I think is correct, which is that deviations from these technology curves, one interpretation for why they exist is because firms make mistakes. So, given that you have these very strong predictions about how you should grow, if you find a firm that is growing in a way that is different from, there is they have a high level of average sophistication, but they don't have a high technology, high sophistication for one business function that is very technology elastic. Okay. According to the model, that's a mistake. That's a big mistake. And one thing that we could do, and we are planning on doing it in the short term, is to measure those instances and see whether those firms turn out to have lower productivity. The firms that make these mistakes, whether they also have lower productivity. Because if you think that the reason why they are doing this is because there is something heterogeneous about these firms that we are not observing, well, probably that shouldn't be affecting productivity so much. But if the reason is that they are making some mistakes, undeniably that's going to have a reflection in productivity. And so that's something that we can test. We can see whether that's the case or not. So I think that by having a theory that seems to be fitting the data so well, and that has both a positive as well as a normative interpretation, I think that we can look at these residuals and use them. And so from that perspective, a policymaker, would like to inform firms, look, in your sector, for firms like you, the optimal way to expand is by doing this and not by doing that. So don't spend your money in doing that. Spend your money in doing this. And that's another interesting policy recommendation. If we document that there are significant mistakes, okay? I mean, the technology cores fit the data very well, but they don't fit it perfectly. So there is significant variation there too.
Thank you so much. So a tiny comment, and this is the last thing I'll say, is it's about the interpretation of the fixed cost not being important because of scale. It doesn't have to be the case because the fixed cost could also scale with the scale of the firm. Think about the implementation of some technology. Could be easier in a smaller firm than in a bigger firm, and therefore the cost. So the smoking gun for fixed cost is the frequency of the adoption of technology, and not necessarily that the fact that the level of sophistication may not be related to size.
No, I agree with that. I mean, we have the firm level fixed effect that is absorbing all the other things. So like, suppose that this fixed cost is relevant for all the technologies, okay? Then that's going to be wiped out from the variation. So that part is not like, that could be the case. Then you could have like very large fixed costs to implement all the technology because say you are a small firm and everything is complicated for you. That's going to be like, we take care of that. We allow for a firm level fixed effect to explain that. And so all of the variation we're exploiting is like, once you take into account these firm level fixed effects, when you take into account this business function, country, firm characteristics, interactions, then then is when we're identifying this variation, and we find like humongous variation. So it's like, we're not ruling out all this. I mean, I agree with you. It's important to explain that well, because I think it's very easy to, and I make that mistake all the time, like, jump into a conclusion, these things are not important, while in reality they may be very important, but they are not important for the object I'm interested in, which is this variation across business functions. So there is a little bit of be more careful in explaining, which I definitely should do.